This story begins with, like every story begins, in my hometown in southwestern Pennsylvania, which I later found out when I went to college was part of Appalachia. I didn't know that until my sociology teacher was teaching me about my home area. But in my town, most of the guys in our school were really into cars. And I was not. I was into sports and other things, but I didn't care about cars at all. My dad knew a lot about cars, and I trusted him to get me around to wherever I needed to go. And my friends eventually got cars, and they drove me around, and that was fine with me. I didn't really want a car. Even went to college outside of town, a long way away, and I was on campus, lived on campus, so I didn't need a car in college, and I didn't want one. And when I got out of college, I worked for a while, and I got married, and my wife had a car already, so I didn't need to buy one. I thought, this is great. I may never have to buy a car. But eventually, that car wore out, and we needed to buy a car, and she said, you've never bought a car. You can go pick out your first car. And I thought, that's great. So I was trying to be responsible. I went and picked up a copy of Consumer Reports. And if any of you tried to buy a car back in the 70s or 80s and you read Consumer Reports, you probably bought a Toyota, because I'm convinced that Consumer Reports had some kind of bribe from Toyota because of the recommendations they gave. And so I went to the Toyota dealer and I looked everything over, and I bought a 1988 Toyota Celica. And I was thrilled with this car. It looked kind of sporty, but it got all the good ratings like all the other Toyotas. So I thought, great, I'm just gonna buy this car. I don't know anything about cars, but I'm just gonna follow the maintenance manual and take it in every time when it hits the mileage, and this should last me for a long time. And that was right, it did. But what happened was I started to realize as I got up over 100,000 miles in this car over a few years, the dealer was getting very expensive with their bills for these routine maintenance milestones. So I asked somebody about that and what I could do to save some money, and they suggested I find a local mechanic. I lived in Carlisle at the time. I parked on the street out in front of my row house in Carlisle. And so I took my neighbor's advice and went and found this local mechanic, and he was very good. He was cheaper than the dealership. He did a good job of taking care of the car and servicing it, and he usually tried to do it in a way that he saved me some money by taking some shortcuts or whatever. And then as the car started to get even older, up around 150,000 miles, I started wondering whether I should look into possibly replacing it. And I talked to him about that, and he said, well, it's a good car, but you have to put a lot of miles on it, and you might not get a lot for it in resale because of the high mileage. He said, if you had an accident and got it totaled, it probably is worth more from the insurance company than it is in selling it. I said, yeah, right. I was laughing. I assumed that was just a sarcastic remark. And so I kept using the car and enjoying it. And then one Sunday afternoon, I came out of my house, got in the car, started it, but it didn't start, as many of these stories reflect. That does happen sometimes. But since I knew nothing about cars, I probably should have had a AAA membership, but I didn't. I should have asked somebody who knew about cars for help, but I didn't. Like a typical fool, I said, oh, I have jumper cables in the trunk. I'll jump the car. So I got my next door neighbor, who was a professor at Dickinson, who also knew nothing about cars, and he agreed to park his car nose to nose with mine, and we would use the jumper cables and start my car. Wells, you need to wait for the end of this. So what happened was we got the thing ready to set up for the jumper cables, and I had read the manual, so I knew how to put the jumper cables on, except I didn't really know how to put the jumper cables on, and I put them on the wrong terminals. Oh, somebody else has done that. Once that happened, flames shot up. I ran into the house, got a fire extinguisher, but by the time I came back out, the flames were roaring. I put the fire out, got it towed to the mechanic, and the mechanic looked at me and he said, "Oh, I think you might have totaled your car because it's going to have all the wiring replaced." And I said, "Well, so be it." So I called the insurance company. The insurance adjuster goes out. He looks at it, and the next day I get a call from him, and he says, "You know, the mechanic's right. You really ruined the whole electrical system. The car's going to have to be totally replaced, but I'm not going to total it. I'm going to give you the cost of that." It was a very expensive number. I forget what it was, but we're going to pay you for that. But I give you one piece of advice: don't have that mechanic do the work. And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because after you left, he told me that he thought you had done this on purpose, that nobody could be stupid enough to have hooked the cables up to the wrong terminals, so you must have tried to do this because you were trying to get rid of your car and get it totaled." And I said, "Well, I certainly agree with you. I'm not going to have him do the work." So I got it towed to the dealer, and they did the work, and that was sort of the end of it. But then 3 years later, I happened to bump into this mechanic at a basketball game, and he's sitting down the row from me, and he looks over and he recognized me, and he said, "Whatever happened to that Toyota Celica?" And I said, "I'm still driving it, 250,000 miles so far." So